Good. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the diary inquiry. We're going to be discussing the whole issue of diaries, whether they're useful, what they're written for, and so on. We have, and I'm going to rattle through very quickly here, on my right, your left, Dominic Sandbrook, who's the author of this fantastic history of the 1970s, but he's also a superb book reviewer and a key figure when it comes to the Sunday Times literary side of the world. Sasha Swire, who is the author of this fantastically best-selling set of her own diaries, and the wife of the Conservative MP, Sir Hugo Swire, who's sitting there in the middle. Then Emma Soames. Emma has edited the diaries of her mother, Clementine Churchill, Winston Churchill's wife, and they are absolutely transfixing.
Mary.
I loved... Sorry?
Mary.
Mary Soames, the daughter of Winston Churchill and of Clementine Churchill, and I've reviewed this for the TLS and absolutely loved it. And then Michael Gove, whom none of you will have heard of, but he's very kindly come along as well. So I'd like to start off by asking each of you what you think, what is the motivation, the real motivation for keeping a diary? There seems so many different motivations, but oh, actually, no, before we even start, hands up, everybody in the audience and on stage, who is keeping a diary at the moment, a daily diary. Okay, very interesting. Now, hang on.
That's really stupid, because they shouldn't tell anyone.
Okay, there you go. Well, we can come on to that. Must they be secret? That's absolutely brilliant. Now, hands up, anyone who has at any stage in their lives kept a diary. Yes, there we are. So we're all failed diarists, most of us really. Okay, to kick off, Dominic, what do you think is the... tell us a few of the motivations and also historical figures and why what you think their motivations were.
Golly, that's a big question. Hi, everybody, first of all. I think the sort of granddaddy of political diaries is Pepys. So Pepys is probably the most famous diarist in the English language, or indeed in any language. Pepys is a political figure, and his diary has some of the elements that all great political diaries have. So he's a fascinating character. His diary is a literary artifact. It's beautifully written, and he's kind of pioneering the form of the diary. But also it's a brilliant window onto high politics and gossip. Gossip, I think, plays a huge part in the success of diaries. Why do people keep them? They keep them to explain themselves to themselves. Sometimes almost therapeutic reasons. They maybe have an eye on publication, maybe an exercise in self-aggrandizement. It may be simply a way of relaxing. You know, it becomes a ritual. Somebody like Tony Benn. Tony Benn's diaries I used a lot in writing about the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And Tony Benn's diaries are wonderful because they're comically fascinating because he doesn't realize how wrong he is. You know, and he's never, you know, even as events prove him wrong, he never kind of learns. So something like that, but he recorded that quite often on tape, and it just became a ritual. It became one of the ways in which he structured his life. He kept his diary. And I think that's the case for a lot of diary writers. It becomes part of the sort of the tapestry of life. Great. Well, there we are. There's three very good motivations, none of which actually mention money or making money or doing it. Of course, Pepys also kept his secretly and in code. And obviously wasn't doing it for publication during his own lifetime. So as you say, there's a lot of psychological reasons for it. Michael, you've recently read the Chips Channon diaries, brilliantly edited by Simon Heffer, who sadly can't be with us today. But what's your feeling, particularly about them, and then maybe more in general about diary writing?
Thank you, Andrew. I think that Chips is probably next to Pepys, the preeminent political diarist in the English language, and he exemplifies many of the characteristics that Dominic mentioned. So the diary is there as a confessional. You pour out all your deepest thoughts. You reveal yourself as you would to no human being through your diary. Chips is honest with his diary in a way that almost none of us would be, even with those closest to us. He reveals his passions, both political and personal. He reveals his hatreds and his enmities. He gives vent to his snobbery and sometimes his prejudice, as I say. But he's doing so because, to an extent, it's cathartic and therapeutic. But he's also doing it, again, as Dominic mentioned, because it fills in those bits of the historical narrative that the principal documents of the time don't necessarily capture. So if you're living life as a politician, you will know that history will be written with reference to Hansard and to official government documents, which relay what the culmination, say, of a cabinet committee decision was. But the motivations of the individuals won't be there. The colour won't be there, just the black and white. And what Chips does is he brings out, for example, the very personal reasons why people clustered around Churchill. So we think of Churchill now, as he was, as the hero of the appeasement story. Chips was very much on the other side. And what he brings out was, in a way, the nobility, as he saw it, of Chamberlain, but also the mixed motives of some of those who attached themselves to Churchill. And so in that sense, it adds that extra dimension. And then the final thing, and this was not the case with Chips, but it has been the case with other diarists, is there is an element also of wanting to explain oneself and justify oneself to one's children, grandchildren, and others. So there's a sense in which a diary can be the conversations perhaps with generations that you could never have had when you were alive. And in extremis, it can be both that conversation and also an endowment. So Woodrow Wyatt's diaries were explicitly written in order to make sure that he could supplement his meagre pension pot with an ongoing income stream for the future. So I think those are the motivations, and they overlap with Dominic's. I think it's the confessional, the cathartic, the therapeutic on one level. It's adding colour that nobody else can, and then it's giving future generations that sense of who you were and why it mattered that you were there. Even if you were only peripheral, you can let them know what it was like to be in the thick of things.
Your mention of Churchill, of course, brings us on to Emma. Why did your mother keep her diary? And have you got any other thoughts about diary keeping in general?
Well, my mother wasn't a Churchill for nothing. And she started her diary in January 1939. So I think she genuinely had a prescience. I mean, you didn't have to be, Meg, the fortune teller, to know that things were coming down, but she was very well aware of what was coming. She developed a sort of passion for her father, and she thought that, she should be his, not quite his Boswell, but getting on that way.
And also, of course, she says he's almost like a religion to me. So there was such a faith in him that comes through in every page of that diary. That was important as well.
Yes, and also selfishly, from her own point of view, she was 16 when she started it, and she wrote this sort of mission statement near the beginning, saying it will be the diary of a young girl on the cusp of womanhood. Well, it's perfectly true, and by 23, when the war ends, she has grown up a lot, and it's very interesting on that level as well.
Yes, in fact, we're going to come on to the way in which diarists change through the life. Sasha, you can tell us, first of all, why you wrote this diary. Obviously, it's a massive bestseller, so that must have been a factor. But were there any other motivations?
I literally had no motivation at all. It's just a habit for me, and it started when I was probably 11 years old, and I've consistently written a diary since that age. It started when my parents sent me to a boys' boarding school, and there were only 5 girls. So I started writing about men locking their stags, locking horns quite early on. So I obviously quite like watching them. I've written a diary because I find it very cathartic. Mostly as a writing exercise because I always wanted to write, and it helped with my observational abilities. It's just developed into a habit, and I'm desperate to give up. I really am desperate to give up. And I thought, well, I'll give up after my husband leaves politics. And then COVID came along, and I thought, oh God, well, if Samuel Pepys can write about it, I'll have to write about it. And then, I suppose, when China invades Taiwan, after the COVID's finished, and then I'll have to write about that, and it'll be the end of civilization, and so it'll just go on and on. But I'm desperate to give up. Yes.
Well, I bet your publishers aren't desperate that you should give up.
It helps. Yeah.
How interesting. So let's talk about the rutting stags of the Cameron administration, because it's very largely about the people at the top of that government. Your husband having been a minister there. To what extent? I mean, we know from the diaries that David Cameron fancied you, but did many other MPs, or were there any, or were there any others that you?
That's what you wrote.
I know you've got your husband in the audience. Obviously, just put your fingers in your ears.
I'm going to say about the Bushes incident. Okay, so there were on that. Allegedly, I don't know if you've read it, but I mean, they allegedly. He said, I can't remember what he said. He said, "That scent is so marvellous. I'm going to push you in the bushes," or something like that. And there was 3 security guards behind, his wife and my husband, and it was on the Southwest Coastal Path, and there was a lot of gorse bushes, so it could have been quite difficult. No, I think where my diary is slightly different to what Michael talks about is that my book is very much about the effects of being close to power. It's not about being powerful, because I had no power whatsoever. So I wasn't in the room making decisions. I am just watching powerful people.
And actually, isn't that, thank you, that's a very good, important observation, because that is true, isn't it, of a lot of the diaries. Samuel Pepys was Secretary to the Admiralty for a short period. He wasn't First Lord of the Admiralty or First Sea Lord or anything like that. Alan Clark was a junior minister. Chips Channon was private secretary to the Undersecretary of State for Foreign Affairs. These are not actual... If you look at all of the prime ministers, there are very few who keep diaries, Harold Macmillan obviously being a major difference. Winston Churchill never kept a diary, tragically. But so maybe the people at the very... Am I right in saying, panel, that the people right at the very top of politics who are spending all their time running the country don't keep diaries, but lots of the people around them, including, of course, Winston Churchill's private secretary, Jock Colville, who called his diaries the fringes of power. So my question to the panel is a diary better if it's written from somebody on the fringes of power rather than at the centre of power? What do you think, Emma?
Well, I think definitely one for the very boring but practical reasons of time. If the Prime Minister has got time to write a diary, surely some mistake.
Yeah. Do you think Boris might be keeping a diary?
Yes, and also they're franker, sorry?
Do you think Boris might be keeping a diary?
He could easily be, I am saying. But I think it's a great position to be in. They're more relaxed, they're less guarded, probably. And certainly in my mother's case, she didn't have an eye to posterity at all. And in fact, she was rather embarrassed by her diaries.
How interesting, was she?
Yeah, she called them hot-making.
Michael, how about, what do you think about
I think that's definitely true.
centrality?
I think you're absolutely right. So,
do you keep one?
No, I don't.
No.
And I think that exactly as Emma says, those who are the principal actors, as it were, the prime ministers, the presidents, and so on. They will be the people who will be chairing each meeting. They will be the people who will be driving events. And they won't have in the room the 360-degree vision that a private secretary or a junior will have. They won't be observing every tick, every response, every muttering and murmuring from those around. And then when the meeting ends, they will sweep out onto the next. And the after gossip, when you get the flavour of the meeting, won't be available to them. So that is why, you're absolutely right, it is Jock Colville or Alan Clark, who was on the fringes of cabinet but never made it, who provide that additional quality. And I think, Sasha's diaries reflect the fact that she would have seen politicians, myself included, preoccupied in, their egotistical unrolling of their views, and she would have been able to see, well, there's Gove making an idiot of himself again, or there's Osborne rolling his eyes while Gove goes on, and so on, while I, all unknowing, would have carried on like most politicians, talking. So in that sense, the best diaries are written by Rosencrantz and Guildenstern and Osric, not by Hamlet.
Yeah.
You know, they're the people who have the ability to judge, to see, and then to cast down with a greater degree of objectivity.
And I think that, I mean, that's certainly true of Macmillan, isn't it? They're not very great diaries, whereas his autobiography, 6 volumes of autobiography, are still highly readable today. His diaries, on the other hand, which have been published in extenso, you know, useful for some historians to pick up whereabouts he was, but not full of those kind of insights that a great diary should be.
No, I think also if one looks back at the sort of the cabinet diarists of the Wilson and Callaghan era, they're interesting, fascinating, but they're not as perceptive or redolent of the era as Sasha's is of the Cameron era or Clark is of the Thatcher era. So if you read Dick Crossman or Barbara Castle, you get a lot out of it, but essentially what they don't capture is the flavour of someone who is just at that one remove. I mean, obviously.
Do you agree with that,
Dominic? I think Michael's being much too generous. I think those diaries are actually incredibly boring.
Yes.
Often. So you know, Dick Crossman's diaries, for example, he fought a huge battle to get his diaries published. I mean, he's one of the people who's pioneered the publication of political diaries. And the title tells you everything. I mean, they're called kind of the Crossman Diaries, Minister for Housing. And then there's hundreds of pages. Wow, this is a lesson to you, Michael. But you know, this would appeal to Michael perhaps, but not to anybody else. There are hundreds of pages about housing policy. I mean, who wants to read that? I mean,
Yeah.
so I think the thing about a diarist as well is a diarist is above all an observer. And if you are, as Michael says, if you're chairing the meetings, if you're caught up in the cogs of the machine, making the machine work, you're not an observer, you're a participant.
And how useful are they as a historical source? Historians have to use them, of course, because they provide these insights and these fun quotations, and there's bitchy and malicious gossip and so on. But are they as accurate as obviously not as accurate as a Hansard statement in the House of Commons, but are they as correspondence, for example, contemporary correspondence? Should that be trusted more than the musings of a person at the end of the day? I'm going to start with Sasha.
Well, I don't know. You know, I mean, I think future diarists, future historians are going to have a real problem because, I mean, I don't even know how to hold a pen anymore. You know,
but we'll have emails and things, won't we?
Yes, we'll have emails, but you know, do people store them? You know, digital preservation is going to be an issue, I think, for historians. Sorry, what was the?
How useful are they to future historians as an accurate reflection of what's happening, or is the sort of psychological motivation of keeping the diary in and of itself a problem with it as a historical source?
Well, I think there's two different. I think there's two different types of diaries. So I think you do have the Ben diaries, which are really about what they did, public service. They were written for publication, actually, whereas my diaries weren't. I mean, I wouldn't have taken on the entire British establishment if I thought I was ever going to publish them. So I think what's important. So. If Michael wrote a diary, for example, it would all be about what was happening in government or whatever. But
how do you know that? I mean, that's not, I don't think that's true at all. I think he's just as likely to write about sort of, I don't know, sex as you do in your diary.
I don't write about any sex.
Oh,
that's
yes,
not fair.
you do.
Do I?
Yes,
absolutely. Oh my gosh, I don't think I do.
Anybody who wants to turn to page 125 and 126 of this book will see.
I just think, so my diary is much more for a reader than for a historian. And I think there is a slightly, so that boils down to how it's edited.
Yeah.
So is it edited for history, or is it edited for the publishers to make money?
And your actual diaries are far bigger than this, aren't they? I mean, this is a tiny.
This is a quarter of that decade. So I was watching the Blair Brown. I recommend it to everyone. It's fantastic. The Blair.
Yes, great show.
Good TV show. And I was watching, and I thought, well, I'll just dip in, because I never look at anything that I've written. So I'll just dip into 1997 or something. And I came, it was just when I first met George Osborne, and we were all going around searching for seats with Hugo. And the first seat that came up was Leominster. I'll try and do this quickly. And George had got up on the stage. He was then William Hague Spad, and he's got up on the, and there was about a room full of people like this, and they said to him, you know, what George, you know, why do you think William Hague's not making any sort of traction? And George just looked at the audience and went, because he's downright ugly. Like that. And I thought, well, you know, if you can say that to 400 people, I can repeat it here, can't I?
But
that's in 1997.
You sure can.
So it does
when you said that you don't reread it,
no, I never reread it.
You must have reread it before it was published.
Yes, of course I read it.
Oh, thank God for that. Otherwise, it would explain a lot.
I did. It was all thrown at the editor as a sort of. He chose what went in, really.
Thank you. No, absolutely, that makes sense. Michael, how useful as a historical... let's start with Sasha's. I don't know if you've read them or not, but would you say they will stand as a historical record?
I read every page. I was gripped. And then reread it, particularly...
Would you like, in 100 years' time, would you like the things that are said about you in that diary to become part of the historical record?
Well, there are one or two references in it that I would like to have as part of the historical record. Others, perhaps, I might...
Pages 125 and 126. Yeah.
Others I might erase. But the thing is that there's a witness. A witness's account in a diary, and some of them are more authoritative than others. And of course, with any witness, any investigator knows that sometimes a narrator can be unreliable, sometimes a narrator can misremember, but they are always useful in helping to build up that overall picture. So it is not the truth, but it is a truth of the time, and you should read it in conjunction with other things. So again, to go back to Dominic's point, if you read Tony Benn's diaries, then the story you get is of this noble, almost Christ-like figure who's attempting to lead the country to a better world, and all around him he faces intrigue from ridiculously evil proto-Thatcherite permanent secretaries who are in the pay of big business attempting to stop him and so on. So he doesn't quite have the self-knowledge of Mr. Pooter, but nevertheless, it is a story and a version, and unwittingly he gives away so much of the politics of the time.
I think, Emma, that I know that your mother's diary has already become part of the historical record, and so it should, because it is, the honest remarks of somebody who was absolutely as close as you can be in the thick of it. Do you think in 100 years' time people will be interested in the day-to-day existence of Winston Churchill, and B, in his daughter, your mother?
Goodness, a long time away, but the thing is, about my mother's diary particularly, I think of diaries as a second draft of history. If journalism is the first and diaries are maybe one of the second, nobody's going to go to Mary Churchill's diary expecting sort of huge amounts of criticism of her father's conduct of the war.
Yeah.
But what she does do is bear witness. She's not in the room when he's taking lots of these decisions, but she's very much his decompression chamber afterwards. And he doesn't like being alone, my grandfather, so he very often summons my mother just to sit with him, really. And he doesn't talk business very much, or if he does, she doesn't record it. But you can't get much closer to power than she was.
And that's very interesting, isn't it, about not recording things. I mean, not in this case deliberately not recording things, but are there things that you shouldn't put in a diary? Obviously, we all know the Alan Clark line about there's nothing more terrible than a discreet diary. Are there some things that are just too, I don't know, too secret? And historically, have you found, when you've been using diaries for historical reasons, Dominic, that you think that there's a gap there, and there's a gap because that diarist just thought, no, this is too personal?
No, I think the best diarists are completely candid. So, give an example, Chips Channon. One of the things that makes Chips Channon's diaries so So brilliant. I don't know why I'm doing Simon. Simon Heffer's not even here. I'm selling his book for him, so he should definitely be paying me commission.
Here it is. Great book.
But they're wonderful diaries, and what's so brilliant about them is he interweaves the story of appeasement, the fall of Chamberlain, the rise of Churchill, with passages where he talks about, he goes to visit a monastery, and he says he wants to see them, he hears the monks whip themselves, he wants to watch it, he wishes the abbot would whip him. Then there's a point where he's walking along one day and he says, I really would love it if a really ugly middle-aged woman would beat me. I would enjoy that enormously.
Well, he did pay for them to do that, didn't he?
So, you know, you can have diarists who are completely frank about quite sordid sort of, well, if you think it is sordid, corners of their...
Okay, hands up who doesn't think any of that.
Of their imagination. And that's for sort of... I mean, Alan Clark, you know, Alan Clark, when he's talking about Margaret Thatcher and he says how much he fancies her, I don't want penetration, I just want a massive snog. You know, I think you can pretty much get away with anything. Yeah. And politically, I mean, to give you an example of an amazing revelation in a diary, in Bernard Donohue's diary, so he was the head of the policy unit at Downing Street in the 1970s for Wilson and Callaghan. There's an incident where Wilson's doctor, a guy called Joseph Stone, comes to him and says, I've been thinking, and I've thought of a way I can murder Marcia Williams, who is Wilson's political secretary, and nobody will know. I can poison her, and it will seem like natural causes. Bernard Donohue writes about this. Joe Haynes, Wilson's press secretary, also writes about this in his memoir of the 1970s. So you can be pretty sure it's true. And if two people, you know, if they can write about that, they can write about anything. I mean, nothing is off limits, I would say.
Was anything off limits in your diaries, Sasha?
Absolutely, tons and tons and tons and tons.
Okay, so tell us what was.
I mean, the thing...
No, generically, obviously.
The thing is that I've said that my unexpurgated version will be left to my children, and then they can... full thing. But I don't actually, to be honest, I'm not like, people sort of say, oh, Alan Clark. I mean, I'm not lustful like Alan Clark. I'm really not. So I don't write about anyone's affairs or anything like that. I mean, you can't, even though you know about them, you know, the legal side of publishing a diary now is really intense. Yeah. And I really very much nearly gave up halfway through, because you can't write about anyone's ill health, you can't write about privacy. So it's all right to write about Michael and like that, because he comes with a defence of public interest. Sorry. But you know, if I'm in a private dinner party or something, I'm invading their privacy. So I have to be very careful. I have to check with them. Is this okay? Is this not okay? So a lot of my private dinners were taken out.
Right.
So you know, I mean, the great thing about the Chips diary, and I just think, I so agree with you, I think they're absolutely fabulous. But he could never have done this when he was alive. No. And also my diary is printed sort of 2 years after. I mean, it's so recent that all these people are still in play. So it makes it even more doubly, and they're building legacies. So it makes it doubly complicated.
It sure does. And so you actually asked permission
I did ask some permissions, not always, but I did ask for some permissions. Yeah.
Did she ask permission for you for what she writes about page 125 and 126, Michael, or not?
I didn't ask Michael any permissions, actually.
No, but retrospectively, I now grant it.
Very good.
He's been brilliant about it, actually. I mean, he sits on a platform.
Who hasn't been?
Well, not
Go on, tell us who. And does I mean, quite a lot of your information presumably must have come from your husband Hugo.
So a lot of my, if I wasn't there, it's secondhand.
Yes,
secondhand news.
Yes, and also in a sense it makes Hugo a character in the diary, doesn't it?
Yes, well, he is a splendid character.
He's a splendid character, but
he's very funny.
Very funny, and obviously very good at remembering witty remarks made at various occasions and things like that. But And I'm not in any way trying to say anything that you won't agree with. I'm sure Hugo. He does slightly come over as a bit of an amiable buffoon, doesn't he? and were you doing that deliberately,
No.
or was that just the way that the diarist?
First of all, what I need to say about that: this is a wife's diary.
Clearly.
Okay. Every woman and wife in this room. You know, his fancy job, you know, 15 people running around after, flying around the world, meeting presidents. He comes home, I'm saying take the rubbish out.
Yeah.
Right, I want none of your fancy stuff in here.
Yeah.
So it's very much, that is the tone of it.
Yes.
And it has been edited, so I mean, I was a little bit worried about that, but he's not a buffoon at all. He's a brilliant.
No, I know he's not. It's just how you.
He's a brilliant man.
Of course not. He's
all
he's
kinds of levels.
Did Hugo read it before
No,
it was published?
no.
That explains a lot as well.
No. He did read it. He didn't know how much I was writing. Basically, it was elaborate pillow talk. He came in from the Commons. He was a little bit tipsy, as they all are in the Commons, because they have to hang around to vote all day long. And he'd come home and he'd say, God, guess what she said, guess what he said. And then he'd go off with his ministerial boxes the next morning. And then I go, so he didn't know what was in there. But before you all think I'm this evil, desperately ghastly woman that ever any man was married to, I did, when the proofs came, I did say to him, you can take out what you want.
And
so we did have a arrangement.
And he didn't read it?
No, he read the legal, he came to the legal meeting.
Right.
The legal proof meeting, which went on and on.
Emma,
Did I handle that
obviously they're utterly brilliant. He'll tell you later whether you handled that well. Emma, obviously with Winston Churchill, as I mentioned earlier, we've got John Colville, who was immensely close to him, wrote about everything he was doing, and in a highly impressive literary sense. But with the Colville diaries, you definitely get a sense of his view of Winston Churchill altering very significantly, because at one point he actually is a friend of Chips Channon and the extreme appeasers, Rab Butler and Alec Hume and people, and he says things about Churchill that he later completely revises. However, he had the guts and the integrity to leave those in the diary, doesn't he? And so isn't the change, the alteration, the evolution of the diarist one of the things that's very interesting in the diary? And tell us more about your mother starting at 16, ending at 23, and the way she sort of grows up in the diary.
Well, yes. I mean, she was pretty much still behind the green baize door when she started it, and her first few entries are all to do with the state of her fingernails and the love of her pony, Patsy. But anyway, Patsy has to go because of the war, and then she starts growing up. But her view of her father, it changes with the war, funnily enough, because first of all, she wakes up, she starts going to the Commons and writing those rather good set pieces. But also she wakes up to the fact, my God, you know, he's got an amazing personality, and he's such a genius. Well, she doesn't use the word genius, but she says she wakes up to the capacity of his brain and his huge personality. And then as the war progresses, she's growing up. She spends more time with her father. And the thing that you get with Mary that you don't get with Jock is the sort of intimate agony that he went through quite often. I mean, in the early 40s, he would be sitting with my grandmother and Mary, and they'd be trying to cheer him up, and he was very depressed, and not Black Dog. This was, you know, something he'd got quite a lot to be depressed about. He had the weight of the world on his shoulders.
Yes.
So she lives through that, and then he starts using her because she starts christening a yacht, a cruiser, HMS Gurkha, and then he starts taking her with him as her ADC. So then she really can be helpful. And the Americans love her, and she has lovely moments off, you know, when he's not on duty and FDR gives them his country retreat. And that's completely charming. And she describes an afternoon she has with her father there. She said, "These are the peaks of my life, the golden peaks of my life." So, and then she really becomes much more sophisticated and really gets a life of her own when she joins the army.
And has relationships with men. Including one that your grandparents disagreed with and ended. So so she's growing up in that sense as well, isn't she?
She is indeed, and there's something I think of as the Chequers effect, which is that when she gets very keen on a young man, she brings him home, and they've hardly got over the threshold of Chequers when she sees them through the eyes of her family and her parents. Can't wait to get them out of the house.
Now, Mary Soames was one of history's truly good people and lovable individuals. But isn't it true, Michael, that a flawed personality often makes a better diarist? And we think of Boswell and his. I mean, in a sense, the life of Johnson is an extended diary. Isn't it true? And we've already heard about Alan Clark. And no, I wouldn't say that you're a flawed person in any way, Sasha. Sorry, but isn't it true that the flaws of the personality of the diarist becomes something that is of itself part of the fascination of reading the diary?
Yes. There's a reason why Inferno is more interesting than Paradiso in the Divine Comedy. And there's a reason why actors enjoy playing villains, and there's a reason why diaries are, and there are exceptions to every rule, but are better when you can see the flaws there.
Yeah.
We talked about Chips Channon's diaries. Originally, they were published, as we know, a generation ago in a very bowdlerised version.
In an appallingly bad. I mean, what Robert Rhodes James did essentially was to publish what Chips Channon's lover gave him, which was in itself bowdlerised, and then he bowdlerised it as well. Robert Rhodes James' reputation does not come out well from these diaries. But talk a little about Channon's his snobbery, his anti-Semitism, obviously gross anti-Semitism to the point of welcoming the Nazis and so on. Is there not a point at which the diarist is so unpleasant that it affects the quality of the diary, or not?
Yes, I think it can be the case that there are moments, and it's true when you're reading Chips Channon's diaries. There are also moments when you read Alan Clark's diaries, where you suddenly you blench, and you think, how can take that view or behave in that way?
Killing the heron.
Yes, I'd stress that neither Chips nor Alan are typical of most Conservative MPs, either in history or today. But there are those moments. To be fair, if Simon were here, he would say that Chips repented of some of his views. It was also the case that in the context of his personal friendships, one person whom he stood by was Leslie Hall-Belisha, who was Jewish, Minister of War, who suffered and lost his job as a result of the anti-Semitism of General Gort, who was the leader of the BEF at that time. So it doesn't take away from the horrific nature of what he wrote, that he subsequently recognised his errors, and on a personal level, when the reality of the Holocaust was made clear, his guilt at what he thought is also made clear. But more broadly, I think the thing about diaries is inevitably one of the things that that attracts the attention are the highly coloured moments. So seeing people at their worst, or sometimes at their best, but also seeing the high octane moments when individuals clash, or the hilarious moments that reveal a character. If you actually had a sort of documentary account of any politician's day, most of it would be cripplingly dull to anyone else. So a long conversation between me and the Chief Secretary of the Treasury about the local government delegated expenditure limits between 2021 and 2022 for unitary authorities with respect to the anti-social care precept, which takes up most of my time. That is not interesting.
Right.
But at the end of the day, when we're gossiping about whatever, that's the bit that we will tell our wives, partners and friends, and that's the bit that will necessarily amuse and entertain. And it's not distorting the picture, it's just the, what's the word? It's the most highly coloured aspect of it.
Just to pick up on that, it's the humanity of the diarist, I think, the flawed humanity, the rounded humanity, that often endears a diarist to us. So Pepys, we talked about Pepys, as the sort of the original political diarist. He hits his wife, he punches his wife in the eye just before Christmas. She can't go out on Christmas Day because she's got a black eye. He molests, the serving women and so on. Even Anne Frank's diary. Anne Frank's diary was heavily cut for publication because her father didn't want a lot of the stuff about her kind of growing sexuality or her rows with her family, her kind of teenage behavior, if you like. So I think those things being put back in have made it a better diary. I think a diary is always better when it's got the kind of complicated, diverse humanity of the protagonist.
Before we open it up for questions, one last round of questions to the panel. The future of diaries and diarists. In this modern age with social media and Instagram and so on, aren't we all diarists? Aren't there so many people that are recording themselves who wouldn't have 20 years ago? That it's a sort of universalization of diary keeping. And what does that mean that diaries are going to be like in 20 years' time if the trend continues? Back to you.
I'm not sure they're the same thing, actually. I think a diary is a literary artifact.
Exactly.
I mean, that's where Pepys came in, because Pepys really did it first. And I think, your sort of random musings on Twitter are not of the same order at all as the sort of regular, often quite honed literary exercise of putting down your I think they're very different.
I totally agree with that, yeah. And I think I use Twitter as a guide to often get very instantaneous reactions. I mean, excluding the nutters, but, from the commentators, it's the quickest way you can get. So are they thinking like me, that sort of, so I think that's very useful. I think it's a literary tradition, and I think anyone who has an interest in the written word or writing, which I do, and which Clark did, and Chips did, I think they'll keep it going. I really do think they will keep it going.
Good.
Yes. I think it's more difficult for you as a historian, but I do think diarists will continue to write, but probably on computers like I do.
Yes. You shouldn't assume that we're excluding the nutters, because we haven't had the questions yet. Emma, what do you think of the future of... and Emma, of course, is a hugely successful editor and journalist of many years, and so it'll be very interesting to hear your views.
Well, I think we've got to reconcile ourselves to sort of diary by Instagram, but it's not going to be a very honest account, I don't think. Really? I mean, I really think this thing of doing some writing every day is a terrifically good exercise, even if 2 years down the line you want to throw it in the fire, which is what I did with my diary when I was 18, and I really wish I hadn't.
Yes. Oh, we all
so
do.
Don't
we
throw
all
it in the fire.
Michael, the future of diaries.
Well, going back to what we were discussing earlier, there is something of the confessional about the diary. You confide in your word processor or your notebook, and when people are on Twitter or on Instagram or any of these things, they're trying, unbelievably when you consider some of these accounts, but they are trying to give a good account of themselves. They're trying to curate their image. Whereas the diaries that will survive in the future, and I'm sure they will continue to be written, are those for people who are honest with and about themselves. And that is something in human character. The desire to confess and confide is always there, and the safest place and the best place for historians will always be the written word.
Don't you think there's also an element of not wanting to live an unarchived life,
yes,
as it is? Not allowing a day to go by without saying something about what you did in that day, because otherwise, that day has just been lost forever, and it's it can never be recaptured.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. There are some people who can't wait, as it were, to shake off each day and to remake themselves and the world in every new day. But as a general rule, that there is a human desire to make sure that that things are recorded and that you can give an account of and to yourself.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, we've got a quarter of an hour. Some questions. The gentleman in the green jacket here, and then if you could then give it to this gentleman there. Sir.
Andrew, if I may inject a colonial note, William Lyon Mackenzie King was the longest-serving Prime Minister of Canada, and he wrote a lengthy entry in his diary every night of his life. Perhaps it was because he was a bachelor, he had nothing else to do. But when he died, his literary executor expurgated 90% of it and redacted it, and now the rest is all available online. King was a bit of a nut. He was a spiritualist, and he spoke to his dead dog and his dead mother. So it's perhaps understandable that this was expurgated, but it's rather a shame.
I've actually used those diaries. I found them quite useful,
And
apart from the dog and the mother.
I'd just like to observe that Sasha is not the first woman to have perhaps written about sex in her diary. The first Duchess
She denies it, by the way.
I don't think there's any sex in my diary.
Well, the first Duchess of Marlborough, you'll be happy to learn, put the following entry in her diary. The Duke, home from the wars today, he pleasured me with his boots on.
Oh.
Right.
Well, I
okay.
don't think I've ever written that.
We're not going to. This gentleman here, thank you.
Given that we sort of established that a lot of the great diaries are almost by necessity published after the writer dies, it sort of implies that perhaps the great diarist of the current age is amongst us. We just don't know who they are. So which current individual do you most hope is keeping a diary that you may one day read?
Oh, that's a very good question.
Well, that's obvious, really. It has to be Boris.
Yes, it does.
I mean, it has to be Boris. Yeah, because he's got such a great turn of phrase.
Yes.
And,
Can you think of anyone? I mean, I think we can just be unanimous on that, can't we? Yeah.
What about Michael?
And Michael.
No, but already he's denied. He's denied it because
But he would, though, wouldn't
the
he?
Ministry of Housing
He must do that.
keeps him too busy. Right, one right at the back there. You need a microphone. Oh, and after this lady, can you give it to the lady right at the back, please?
Yeah. So I work for the Londoners Diary, and I just wondered what you think of the kind of relevance and I won't be offended, of social diaries, like the Times diary, the newspaper diaries, basically.
Yes, which of course, Harold Nicholson himself, one of the great diarists, who we should have mentioned earlier, of course, said that that working on the Evening Standard Londoner's Diary was. Actually, I'm not going to say out loud what he said. It was. But anyway, it's got lots of great swear words in it. Gossipy diaries, useful. I mean, do you think this lady will become a great diarist, having been a gossip columnist?
Yes. One of my first jobs after leaving university was working on the Peterborough column of the Daily Telegraph. I worked there for a brief period, and I was surrounded by a galaxy of talent. So people like Robert Hardman, Quentin Less,
who's spoken here today,
Petronella Wyatt, Susanna Herbert. There were a range of people who've gone on to be great journalists and great writers who were there. There are also those of us who were there who subsequently failed to make much of a career for themselves in journalism and had to find another way of keeping the wolf from the door. But yes, I think that Max Hastings was at one point, I think, a newspaper diarist, Alan Rusbridger, and so on. So yes, I can think of few better apprenticeships. And the thing about newspaper diaries is that the best newspaper diaries always have something in them that is true, something in them that is libelous, and something in them that is salacious. I'm afraid I can only supply information that is true. For the defamatory and the salacious, you'll have to go to other members of the panel.
I think I would just say I was a journalist, and I think you do, as a journalist, acquire a skill of what the story is and what's interesting to the reader. So I think, yes, the transition could be quite easy.
Happy about gossip being...
You know what? I think a lot of the gossip in the sort of society diaries, it's completely impenetrable to future generations. I mean, that's also true, funnily enough, of Chips's diaries to an extent. You know, there'll be stuff where he sort of says, I don't know, Nigel Molesworth has missed out on the job as PPS and it's gone to Fotherington Thomas instead. The Hubert Laneites are delighted and all this sort of... And you're like, who are these people?
Well, luckily
no one
Simon
knows.
says, doesn't he? They're brilliantly edited, and Simon has literally thousands and thousands of footnotes who tells you who everybody is, and then often another useful tidbit of information. But you're right. Yes, that's true. Emma, have you got any thoughts about the usefulness? Have you edited any newspapers that use gossip columns?
on Londoners Diary Most people were on Londoners' Diary for 6 months and then went on to some glittering job.
Yeah.
I was on it for 5 years and then became shopping editor.
Do you think your time as a...
But I had the great honour of working for Max Hastings,
Yeah.
who spent half his day trying to fire me.
Right.
But anyway, of course gossip is great for diaries, but I don't think that you should stop keeping a diary if on one day you haven't got a particularly juicy bit of gossip to... And I don't think you have to be a journalist. I really don't think it should be confined to the fourth estate.
No. Next question. There was the other lady at the back, yes.
Michael,
Do speak up because of the rain.
That's right. Michael just made the most eloquent case for why he should be keeping a diary. He's mischievous, he's witty. I thoroughly disagree with his politics, by the way. I'm not generally praising Michael, but he's a fantastic raconteur and speechmaker, and he knows all the gossip, and he's the person who should be keeping the diary of this administration. Michael, are you telling the truth when you say that you're not keeping a diary? And if you are, how can you possibly justify that to posterity?
Well, that's incredibly flattering and kind, but no, I'm afraid that I don't have the perspicacity or the humility necessary in order to keep an effective diary. So sadly not. But one thing I could do, Jenny, is perhaps at the end of the day dictate my thoughts and reflections direct to you over a drink, and then you can preserve it for later.
Next question. There was one there. Lady in the middle there.
Hi. So when it comes to like diary writing, like individuals, they bare their souls into like what they're writing. But when you want to kind of like express an individual's stories, when they want to get it publicized, what's the point of actually writing a diary when you have to, like, in the age of like censorship and where you have to delete parts of your life that are truly necessary and that they express you as an individual? So my question is essentially like, what's the point of writing a diary then?
Well, it's a very good question, and I think most diarists get to a point, like I did, and think, what the hell am I doing this for? And that does happen, and it happened to me, as I said, in 2019 when my husband left politics. I have to absolutely stress, and I think Chips would say the same, it's an utter addiction, it's a compulsion, it's something that drives you, that it almost has a life of its own, so...
And maybe there is another more positive angle with the life of George III, for example, who himself never kept a diary. But if we hadn't had two people, Fanny Burney, who was in his court, or at least his wife's court, and also Robert Fulke Greville, who was in his court, we wouldn't know about his malady, the famous King's malady, when he went mad, only from doctors' reports rather than from anything personal or, in both of their cases, profoundly moving. So if you are a figure who is seeing something historically important going on, I think you've got there's a bit of a duty. Yes, there's something. If you're Winston Churchill's daughter and living at number 10 Downing Street in Chequers during a world war, you especially if you have in the Churchill blood this capacity for writing. I think it's up to you to help future historians. I am speaking obviously as a historian, but nonetheless, would you agree with that, Michael?
Totally. And I think the thing is that it might feel as though anyone in the audience might feel at certain points that their voice might be stifled, that there are things that they can't or shouldn't say. But you should, if you can, if you feel moved to, keep a diary and be completely honest. So, one of the greatest diaries not written in the English language is a diary written by a man called Victor Klemperer in Germany. And he was writing, first of all, at a time of Nazism and then subsequently at a time of communism. If the authorities, had known, it wouldn't have gone well for him to have been keeping the diary that he was during the Nazi era. But it's an invaluable testimony of what was going on at that time. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that we're living under, well, you know what I mean. Keeping your own diary and being true to yourself in what you put down I think is an incredibly valuable thing in itself. And who knows, someday, when your diary is published, people will read it, will be moved by it, and will also feel, well, I think that too, and will be inspired by your insights. So please, 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 if you feel that you can, do keep that diary, because others who may go on to read it in the future, including historians, but also individuals who will admire how you thought and felt, will be so glad that you did.
Another question. That person with a hand up, who I can't see who it is, but that one there in the middle. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I was just wondering, we're living in an age at the moment where there's cancel culture, and we're holding responsible previous diarists for the values that we have now. How do you think that influences today's diarists, or how should it, or should they rebel against it?
Dominic, what do you think?
It's a bit like the last question, I suppose. I think it's true that when people read, let's say, Chips's diary, they are shocked by the anti-Semitism or the racial epithets and so on. But that obviously doesn't mean that Chips has been cancelled. I mean, Chips's diaries are immensely successful. I think there's no point writing a diary unless you're going to be completely honest, and that means, you know, bearing your soul as much as you can to yourself and to your future reader, if there is one. And I don't think cancel culture should come into it. I mean, of course, the future readers of any diary will think that the diarist has views and assumptions that they don't share by definition. We don't share Pepys's assumptions. The readers in the 24th century won't share Sasha's. That's simply inevitable. I mean, that's true of any form of writing. It's true of anything we do in our lives at all.
I mean, but also I'd say, you know, I write about cancel culture, and I write about my reaction to cancel culture, and I write about my arguments with my two young girls who are very wokey, and I write about their arguments. So culturally, historically, that'll be there. So it's in my book. So you can write about things that are happening now and what your feelings are about them. So, you know, you don't have to not write about them.
Next question. This lady just here.
Hi, thank you very much. It's been a really interesting talk. My question is for Sasha. I was wondering if you could elaborate, if you don't mind, sort of on the process by which, so you sort of mentioned that you never thought while you were writing your diaries that you would ever publish them. So I was just wondering if you were able to sort of talk through the process by which you then did end up publishing them.
Why I did publish them. Yeah. So, like I said, I think it was, I had all this material, and I actually sent a 2-line email to an agent who had done diaries, and I said, look, I don't want representation or anything. I just like a view, you know, because when you're inside a political bubble, as Michael and I, my husband, are, you're very much on the inside. So I wasn't really sure whether these were of any interest, because they were a wife's perspective. Of course, that was what the interest was in the end. But so, you know, it was all it was literally a whirlwind. It was very quick. It all happened within 2-3 weeks. I was slightly shoved in the back seat, and I wanted, my husband had finished, and I'd been his political researcher, and I'd got to a point when I just wanted to come out from behind his shadow, and I wanted to have a writing career of my own. So that was, I have to tell you, that was my main motivating factor to publishing, yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, all these books are for sale at the bookshop. Please brave the rain and come and buy some. Thank you very much to our panel.